the ego. This is from the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. And to all he said, if anyone wishes to be a follower of mine, he must leave self behind. Day after day, he must take up his cross and come with me. Whoever cares for his own safety is lost. But if a man will let himself be lost for my sake, that man is safe. What will a man gain by winning the whole world at the cost of his true self? The great hindrance to this journey, this following of Christ, is the way in which we falsely identify ourselves with our ego. Perhaps we as religious people take it a little too much for granted that it's a good thing to leave self behind. I was once talking to a rather successful businesswoman in New York who came to a talk I was giving there, and I gave this talk on leaving ego behind, which you wouldn't think anyone could really object to. She came up afterwards and she said, "What nonsense you're talking. I don't want to leave my ego behind." She said, "I am my ego." And at least I think she had a clear sense of what she believed. We, most of us, I think, identify ourselves with our ego unconsciously. As we do the work of this prayer, we come to understand ourselves, our ego, more clearly. And we see that the ego is both the cause and the state of suffering. The Buddha said, life is suffering, and suffering is life. He's referring to, I suppose, the ego. The ego manifests itself in many ways, of course, as we know, and gets into everything, into our spiritual work, into our spiritual journey. We don't lose the ego when we come into a religious life. We don't lose the ego even when we begin to pray. There are certain signs of the ego's activity that we become more aware of as we become more simple. The first sign of the ego is the desire to be great. The desire, for example, to be number one. The desire to dominate. Then there is the desire to take. The ego wants to take rather than give, or rather than let be. And the ego desires to keep, to hang on, to cling, to possess, not to let go. The ego desires to advance, to get more, to be more, to know more, to own more. And the ego desires to hold on to everything, even at the expense of others, putting ourselves, in other words, before others. Those characteristics of egoism, characteristics of every activity, spiritual, physical, mental, that we might be involved in. And so there is a real danger, particularly for the religious person, of an egotistical spirituality, a spirituality that desires to be great, that desires to take an experience of God or holiness, to keep it, to gain more, and to hold on to it even at the expense of others. The sayings of the fathers in the desert are really a constant commentary upon the dangers of an egotistical spirituality, which is perhaps why St. John of the Cross tells us to give up all desire, even the desire for God. Not the love of God, not our innate longing for God that we cannot give up, but our desire for God, desire to possess, to control, to own, to keep God. And in this way of prayer, in the simple ascesis of the single word, we strike at the root of sin, as the Cloud of Our Knowing called it, at the root of our ego. We let go. There's a phrase in, I think, Alcoholics Anonymous, let go, let God. Now, of course, the ego is a natural stage of the development of our humanity. The ego develops at a certain age in a child, and the ego is a necessary and useful force or tool, instrument of consciousness. Without an ego, we wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. We wouldn't be able to relate to others. It isn't that the ego is bad in itself. There's nothing in human nature that is in itself bad. Therefore Jesus, who was fully human, must have had an ego. And yet Jesus did not sin, a man like us in all things, but sin. So how do we understand the problems of egoism? All these hindrances, all these faults can even get into our spiritual life. But if we look at Jesus, what we see, I think, is a man who certainly had an ego, who could say, I, and who had a will, who could give up his ego and his will at the end of his life. Not as I will, but as you will. So a man who had an ego, clearly a strong ego, but a man who did not sin because he never identified himself with his ego. He never said, I am my ego. That was the great temptation that he went through in the desert, to identify himself with the tendencies of egoism. He was tempted. The ego clearly manifested its tendencies in him, but he never identified his real self with the ego. We who have sinned have the work of detaching ourselves from that identification, breaking that identification, simply waking up, in other words, to the fact that we have an ego, and it's a useful thing as long as it's there, but it is not who I am. Ego is not my true and deepest identity. This presents, I think, a great challenge to modern culture, our contemporary society, because the ego is so hyperactivated in our society. The ego is the great force of a technological and consumer society. Technological society which wants to be in control of everything, and a consumer society that is dominated by desire. What we have to be particularly careful of in such a culture is the creation of a consumer spirituality, or a technological spirituality. A spirituality that becomes identified with psychological techniques, for example, or a spirituality that becomes identified only with the desires of spiritual jollies, spiritual pleasures. And I think this is the role of asceticism in a society like ours. It's the understanding that asceticism and the essential ascesis of the Christian life is prayer. Asceticism is the way in which we recover the primary will in the human person. And the primary will is deeper than the desires of our ego. Primary will is a natural inclination, tendency towards God. What this early Cistercian fathers call the pondus, the natural gravity in the soul that draws us towards God. And the purpose of asceticism is not to crush the will or punish, but to clear away, to clear the blocks, to unfold the mind, and to reveal this essential goodness at the core of the human person, so that what we do is right, and what we wish to do is right. And in this way of prayer, in the simple ascesis of the single word, we strike at the root of our ego.